Welcome to another slow descent into sleep. Tonight's story opens on a single lantern, swaying in the cold wind, at the edge of a sleeping medieval village. Beneath the thatched roofs, the fire has burned low, and behind shuttered windows, every breath is counted by the dark. Only one figure moves, cloaked in wool and shadow, walking the narrow lanes with steps meant not to wake the living. In their hands a key of iron, heavy with secrets, and in their eyes the weight of what must be done before dawn. The air smells of wet earth and wood smoke, the silence broken only by the creak of the lantern's chain, and the unseen things that watch from beyond the hedgerows. Let the night close around you. Let the shadows keep your secrets. And if these quiet wanderings bring you comfort, you might consider subscribing or telling us where and when you're listening from. Now, close your eyes and walk the village in silence until sleep finds you. The beds are shared, the straw creaks, the snoring begins before the candle goes out. In the small village of Millhaven, where the stone church tower catches the last purple light of evening, the familiar ritual of sleep begins as it has for countless generations before. The year is 1347, and the autumn air carries with it the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke, mingling with the earthier aromas of livestock and yesterday's porridge, still clinging to wooden bowls. Here, in this cluster of timber and stone dwellings, pressed close together like sleeping animals seeking warmth, the day surrenders to night with the same weary resignation that marks all endings in this age of difficult living. Thomas the carpenter, his joints stiff from 43 years of hard labor, climbs the narrow wooden ladder to the loft he shares with his wife Margaret and their youngest daughter, little Anne, barely 7 winters old. The rungs creak under his weight, each sound a familiar note in the evening's quiet symphony. His calloused hands, permanently stained with wood shavings and linseed oil, grip each rung with the careful precision of a man who has learned that even simple movements can bring unexpected pain. When bones grow weary and muscles protest the day's demands, Margaret has already settled into their shared bed, a construction of rough-hewn oak planks supporting a thick mattress of straw, barley husks, and whatever scraps of wool they could gather or trade for over the years. The mattress sags in the middle where their bodies have worn a permanent hollow, and tonight, like every night, they will roll inevitably toward each other, not from romantic inclination, but from simple gravity and the practical need for shared warmth. The bed creaks as Thomas lowers himself down, and Margaret shifts slightly to make room, though room is a relative concept in a bed designed more for survival than comfort. Little Anne lies between them, her small body generating surprising amounts of heat, despite her delicate frame. She wears a rough linen shift that her mother painstakingly mended just last week, closing holes that had grown too large to ignore. The child's breathing has already found the deep rhythm of early sleep, though she occasionally twitches as dreams chase themselves through her young mind. Her hair braided to prevent tangles and discourage the lice that seem to find children's heads as attractive as flowers find bees. Spills across the single pillow they all share, a lumpy affair stuffed with goose feathers that have seen better days, and now provide more memory of comfort than actual softness. The wooden shutters, warped with age and moisture, fit imperfectly across the single window, allowing thin streams of cool air to whisper through the gaps. These drafts carry with them the night sounds of the village, the distant lowing of cattle in the common field, the occasional bark of a dog investigating some mysterious night business, and the ever-present rustle by of small creatures, mice, rats, and other nocturnal visitors, going about their eternal quest for crumbs and warmth within the walls and thatch overhead. Thomas pulls the wool blanket up to his chin, feeling the familiar scratch of the coarse weave against his skin. The blanket woven by Margaret during the long winter evenings 3 years past bears the honest scent of the dish sheep from which it came, a smell that has become as much a part of sleep as the darkness itself. Somewhere within its fibers live tiny creatures that emerge in the night to feast on human skin, causing the predictable scratching that punctuates sleep like a slow, irregular drumbeat. Thomas accepts this irritation with the philosophical resignation of a man who has learned that comfort and sleep are not necessarily connected concepts. In the cottage next door, separated by walls thin enough that conversations can be overheard and coughs shared involuntarily, Walter the weaver and his wife Eleanor prepare for their own version of rest. Their dwelling houses not only themselves, but Walter's elderly mother, who sleeps on a straw pallet near the dying embers of the hearth, and their 2 sons, Geoffrey and young William, who share a corner bed that seems to grow smaller each year as the boys grow larger. Eleanor, her fingers still stiff from a day of spinning wool into thread, lies with her back pressed against Walter's side, feeling the familiar rhythm of his breathing as it begins to slow towards sleep. Between them, invisible but undeniably present, lies the scratchy wool of their shared blanket and the knowledge that the night will bring its usual interruptions. The baby's cry from across the lane, the sound of someone relieving themselves in the alley behind the houses, the crash of something falling in the darkness, followed by muttered curses that carry clearly through the thin walls. Walter's breathing deepens, and within moments, the first gentle rumbles of his snoring begin to vibrate through the bed frame. It is not the thunderous snoring that will come later in the night, when deeper sleep claims him completely, but rather the preliminary growls that announce his gradual departure from consciousness. Eleanor has learned to find comfort in these sounds, for they mean that her husband has found peace from the day's worries about orders unfulfilled, and thread that breaks to Isley and customers, who question the quality of his work while counting their coins with obvious reluctance. Young William, 12 years old, and already showing signs of his father's broad shoulders, shifts restlessly in the bed he shares with his older brother, Geoffrey. The straw beneath them rustles with each movement, and occasionally a sharp stem pokes through the rough linen tick to remind them that even this simple comfort comes with its price. William's stomach rumbles quietly, For supper was bread and thin porridge tonight, as it has been for many nights when the weaving brings in barely enough to keep thread on the loom and fuel in the hearth. Geoffrey, at 15, already learning his father's trade and feeling the weight of impending manhood, lies still but awake, listening to the night sounds and thinking thoughts that seem too large for his young head. He hears his grandmother's breathing, shallow and irregular from her place by the hearth, and wonders with the casual morbidity of youth how many more winters she will see. These thoughts do not disturb him particularly. Death is as familiar as birth in his world, as ordinary as bread going stale or milk going sour. Across the narrow lane that separates the cottages from the monastery, Wall, Brother Francis, the newest novice in the community of St. Bartholomew's, lies on his narrow bed in the dormitory, listening to the breathing of a dozen other monks in various stages of sleep. The monastery beds, while sparse, offer certain advantages over the village accommodations. Each brother has his own space, marked off by thin curtains that provide the illusion, if not the reality, of privacy. And the straw is changed more regularly under the watchful eye of the brother infirmarian, who believes that cleanliness, while not precisely next to godliness, certainly makes for fewer interruptions to the night prayers. Brother Francis, whose name was once simply Francis Miller before he took his vows 6 months ago, still struggles with the adjustment to monastic life. His body, accustomed to the softer bed he had shared with his wife before she died of fever the previous spring, finds the narrow monk's cart and thin straw mattress a nightly challenge. The wool blanket, dyed brown with oak bark, scratches against his chin, and the linen sheet beneath him, while clean, carries the institutional smell of lye soap and the accumulated breath of countless brothers who have slept here before him. The dormitory windows, larger than those in the village cottages and covered with oiled parchment rather than wooden shutters, allow more of the night air to enter, along with more of the night sounds. Brother Francis can hear the village settling into sleep, the creak of settling timbers, the distant splash of someone emptying a chamber pot into the midden, the soft murmur of parents settling children who have awakened with bad dreams or full bladders. In the bed next to him, Brother Thomas, not to be confused with Thomas the carpenter, for the world seems determined to economize on names as much as everything else, begins the soft, rhythmic snoring that Brother Francis has learned to anticipate. Brother Thomas has been at the monastery for 23 years, and his sleep carries the deep authority of a man who has made peace with his narrow bed, his scratchy blanket, and the certainty that tomorrow will bring the same routine of prayers, work, and simple meals that have shaped his days for more than 2 decades. The monastery bell tower looms above them all, its bronze bell silent now until the next call to prayer. The brother assigned to ring the bell for matins sleeps fitfully, part of his mind always listening for the internal clock that will wake him in the deep hours of the night to call the community to prayer. This partial wakefulness is both blessing and curse. He rarely oversleeps his duties, but he also rarely experiences the deep, uninterrupted rest that comes to those whose responsibilities end with sunset. Back in the village, In the cottage that houses the miller's family, young Peter lies in a bed shared with his 2 brothers, listening to the sound of the mill wheel turning slowly in the stream below their window. The wheel turns even at night, powered by the steady flow of water that has carved this valley over countless generations. The sound is hypnotica steady, rhythmic creaking that speaks of grain being ground into flour, of the endless cycle of work that defines their lives as surely as the seasons defined the year. Peter's father, the miller himself, sleeps in the larger bed across the room with his wife and youngest child, a daughter not yet walking. The miller's sleep is deep and reliable, for his work demands physical strength. That leaves little energy for the luxury of lying awake with worries. His hands, permanently dusted with flour despite evening washings, rest peacefully on the rough wool blanket, and his breathing carries the contentment of a man who has found his place in the world and sees no particular reason to question it. The miller's wife, whose name is also Margaret Eirene, apparently as popular as Thomas among the villagers, lies with one arm curved protectively around their baby daughter. The child sleeps with the complete abandon of the very young, her small fists curled near her face, her breathing so soft it barely stirs the air. Margaret, the miller's wife, has learned to sleep lightly, her mother's instincts always half alert for the signs that the baby needs feeding or comforting. But tonight the child seems content to dream whatever dreams come to those who have not yet learned that the world contains disappointment and discomfort in roughly equal measure. In the stone house at the edge of the village, where Sir Edmund, the local Lord's steward, makes his residence, a different sort of sleep begins. The house, built of stone rather than timber and wattle, offers better protection from the weather and the sounds of the village, though it also brings its own challenges. Stone walls that weep with moisture in certain weather, floors that remain cold even in summer, and a grandness that requires constant maintenance to prevent decay. Sir Edmund, though not truly a knight, but bearing the courtesy title that comes with his administrative position, sleeps in a bed that would seem luxurious to the villagers. A wooden frame carved with simple decorations, a mattress stuffed with feathers as well as straw, and sheets of linen fine enough to have come from a distant city. Yet even this elevated comfort comes with its own discomforts. The carved bed frame creaks with every movement. The feather mattress tends to compact into lumps that create valleys and hills across its surface, and the fine linen sheets, while soft, provide less warmth than the coarse wool blankets used by the common folk. Lady Eleanor, Sir Edmund's wife, lies beside him in a linen nightgown that reaches to her ankles, her long hair plaited and covered with a nightcap that she hopes will discourage the lice that respect neither social station nor personal hygiene. She has spent the evening applying a mixture of lavender and pennyroyal to her hair and bedding, an expensive remedy against the tiny creatures that seem to regard human heads as their rightful domain. The herbs create a pleasant scent, but their effectiveness remains questionable, and Lady Eleanor has learned to sleep with one hand ready to scratch without fully waking. Their eldest son, Richard, nearly grown at 17, sleeps in a smaller chamber adjacent to his parents' room. The chamber, barely large enough for a bed and a chest for his few belongings, represents a luxury unknown to the village children, privacy and space of his own. Yet Richard often lies awake longer than his social inferiors, for with privilege comes the burden of awareness, knowledge of the political uncertainties that affect his father's position, understanding of the complex relationships between lord and tenant that determine the family's continued prosperity, and the gradually dawning realization that his own future will require navigation of social currents, far more treacherous than anything the village children will ever need to consider. The night deepens around the village like a familiar blanket, heavy with moisture from the nearby stream, and fragrant with the lingering scent of cooking fires and the earthier aromas of animals and humanity living in close proximity. The sounds of settling begin. The creak of cooling timbers, the rustle of straw as bodies seek more comfortable positions, the soft scratching of fingernails against wool and linen as the night's smaller inhabitants begin their own routines. In the cottage where the widow Alice lives alone, the silence is different from the communal quiet of the family dwellings. Alice, whose husband died of fever to winters past, has grown accustomed to sleeping without the background rhythm of another person's breathing, though she still sometimes wakes in the night reaching for a warmth that is no longer there. Her cottage, smaller than the others, and showing signs of the minor repairs that remain undone when there is no man to tend them, settles around her with familiar sounds, the whisper of wind through the loose thatch, the scurry of mice in the walls, the distant howl of a dog that speaks to something wild and lonely in the night. Alice's bed, which once seemed too small for two, now feels vast and empty around her single form. The straw mattress has developed a permanent depression on her side, while her husband's side remains stubbornly flat and unwelcoming. She pulls her woolen cloak over the rough blanket, for the cottage loses heat quickly once the fire burns down. 2 coals, and her aging body seems less capable each year of generating the warmth that once came so easily. The wooden crucifix on the wall above her bed catches occasional glints of moonlight that filter through the gaps in the shutters, and Alice finds comfort in its familiar presence. She whispers a prayer before sleep, though the Latin words learned in childhood come imperfectly to her lips. In pace dormio, et exisem in peace. I will sleep and rest. The words blur together as sleep approaches, becoming less prayer than lullaby, less petition than acceptance. Throughout the village, the ritual continues. Bodies settling into the hollow places worn by countless nights of sleep. Hands pulling rough blankets closer to chins. Feet searching for warm spots that will remain elusive until shared body heat begins to accumulate beneath the covers. The sounds blend into a gentle symphony of rest beginning. The creak of rope bed frames adjusting to weight, the whisper of straw compressing under bodies, the soft exhalations that mark the transition from wakefulness to the first stage of sleep. Brother Francis, in his monastery cell, tries to remember the prayers he is supposed to recite before sleep, but the Latin words swim together in his tired mind, mixing with memories of his wife's voice and the sound of the mill wheel and the steady breathing of his fellow monks. The words become rhythm, and rhythm becomes breath, and breath becomes the gentle current that carries him toward the first sleep of the night. The village cat, a battle-scarred Tom, who belongs to everyone and no one, picks his way carefully along the narrow alley between the cottages, stepping round puddles left by the afternoon rain and investigating the interesting scents that accumulate wherever humans live in close quarters. His presence goes largely unnoticed, though occasionally a sleeper stirs at the sound of his soft padding, or the rustle of something small fleeing his approach. In the monastery chapel, a single candle burns before the altar, its flame dancing in the draughts that seem to find their way through even the best constructed buildings. The flame will burn until morning, when Brother Francis, or one of his fellows, will light a fresh candle from its dying ember, continuing an unbroken chain of light that has persisted through all the nights since the monastery was founded a century ago. The candle's light reflects off the brass candlesticks and the polished wooden cross, creating small pools of golden warmth in the vast darkness of the chapel. The light serves no practical purpose. At this hour no one will read by it. No work will be done in its glow, but it continues to burn as an act of faith, a small defiance of the darkness that claims the world each night. As the first sleep settles over the village like a gentle hand smoothing wrinkled bedclothes, the sounds begin to change. Conscious rustling gives way to the involuntary movements of the body adjusting to rest. Breathing deepens and slows, finding rhythms that will persist through the hours of darkness. Occasionally someone coughs or turns over with a creak of bed, frame and rustle of straw, or mutters words that belong to dreams rather than waking thought. The night air moves through the village like a slow river, carrying scents and sounds from cottage to cottage, mixing the breath of sleepers with the smoke of dying fires and the earthier aromas of animal and vegetable life that define the boundaries between human habitation and the wild world beyond. The air is cool but not cold, touched with the dampness that comes from living near water, and surrounded by growing things that exhale moisture into the darkness. In Thomas the carpenter's loft, little Anne stirs briefly, her small hand reaching out in sleep to touch her mother's arm. The contact seems to satisfy some deep need for connection, and she settles back into the steady breathing of deep sleep. Margaret, roused briefly by her daughter's movement, listens for a moment to the familiar sounds of her family sleeping, her husband's gentle snoring, her daughter's soft breaths, the creak of the building settling round them. These sounds, which might seem like disturbances to someone unaccustomed to shared sleeping, instead provide comfort, the audible proof that her family is safe and near and breathing. The monastery bell tower stands silent against the star-scattered sky, its bronze bell waiting patiently for the hour when it will ring matins and call the brothers to their midnight prayers. The bell has witnessed thousands of nights like this one, has called countless generations of monks to prayer, but marked the passage of seasons and years with its steady voice. Tonight it rests, but its presence hovers over the village like a gentle blessing, a reminder that even in sleep Some keep watch and offer prayers for those who slumber. Walter the weaver's snoring has deepened into the more substantial rumbling that his wife Eleanor knows will continue until dawn. She has learned to find comfort in the sound, for it means that her husband's body has found the rest it needs to face another day of difficult work. The rhythm of his breathing creates a steady counterpoint to the night sounds around them. The rustle of mice in the thatch, the distant bark of a dog, the whisper of wind through the gaps in the shutters. Young William, in the bed he shares with his brother Geoffrey, has finally found a position that allows his growing body some measure of comfort on the narrow space available to him. A sharp piece of straw that had been poking through the mattress tick has finally been pressed flat, and his arm has found a comfortable angle that will allow blood to flow freely through. Benight, these small victories over discomfort seem disproportionately important in the moments before sleep, and William drifts toward rest with the satisfaction of a battle won. The night deepens around them all, and the first sleep begins in earnest. Bodies relax into the hollows worn by countless previous nights, muscles releasing the tension of the day's work, minds letting go of the small worries and large fears that occupy the daylight hours. Sleep comes gradually, like water seeping into dry earth, bringing with it the mercy of temporary forgetfulness and the promise of dreams that may, if fortune smiles, be pleasant. The straw settles beneath sleeping forms. The scratchy wool grows familiar against skin. The night sounds blend into a gentle symphony of rest. Someone coughs briefly and settles back into silence. Someone scratches automatically at an itch and continues sleeping. Someone sighs deeply and sinks further into the forgiving darkness. The village sleeps, as it has slept for generations before and will sleep for generations to come. The troubles of the day fade into the background. The discomforts of medieval life become simply the price paid for the privilege of rest, and the first sleep of the night spreads its gentle blessing over cottage and monastery, noble and peasant, young and old, and the night drifts on, carrying them all toward morning on the slow current of dreams and darkness, breath and silence, the scratch of wool, purr, and the whisper of straw, the comfort of shared warmth and the peace that comes. Finally, when the body admits its need for rest and the mind releases its grip on the waking world, the candles flicker lower, the fires burn down to coals, the moon traces its ancient path across the sky, and sleep, it is neither night nor morning, the monk whispers, the goat sneezes, the girl stirs. The village does not sleep as one continuous breath, but rather in the ancient rhythm that has governed human rest since time began its slow count of seasons. The first sleep, deep and necessary, carries the inhabitants of Millhaven through the early hours of darkness, but it does not claim them completely until dawn. Instead, somewhere in the deepest part of the night, when the moon has traveled halfway across its destined path, and the air grows thin with the approaching promise of morning still hours away, the wakeful interlude begins. It starts, as these things often do, with the smallest disturbance in the regular rhythm of sleep. In the cottage where Thomas, the carpenter, dreams of wood that splits cleanly and joints that fit perfectly. A drop of water, having worked its way slowly through the thatched roof above, gathers sufficient weight to fall from the lowest point of a sagging beam and lands with a soft splash in the wooden bowl that Margaret has learned to keep positioned precisely for this purpose during the rainy season. The sound is barely noticeable, hardly more than the whisper of mouse feet across floor rushes, but it penetrates the light layer of sleep that covers Thomas's consciousness like morning mist over still water. His eyes open in the darkness, not with the startled alertness that comes from sudden noise, but with the gradual awareness of a man whose body has learned to surface from sleep as gently as it descends into it. Thomas lies still for a moment, listening to the familiar catalogue of night sounds that surround his family's rest. Margaret's soft breathing beside him, little Anne's even softer exhalations, the distant lowing of cattle in the common field, and the ever-present rustle of small creatures going about, their nocturnal business in the thatch above and the walls around them. These sounds, which might alarm a stranger, provide comfort to Thomas. They are the audible proof that his world continues its ancient patterns, that the night holds no unusual threats, that his family sleeps safely within the circle of familiar disturbances. He shifts slightly, feeling the straw beneath him rustle and compress into a new configuration that might possibly provide greater comfort for his joints, which carry the accumulated protests of 43 years of physical labor. The movement causes the rope bed frame to creak a sound so familiar that neither Margaret nor Anne stirs at its production. The wool blanket scratchy against his skin and bearing the honest scent of the sheep from which it came, settles around his shoulders as he adjusts his position, and somewhere within its course weave tiny creatures continue their eternal feast on human skin, causing the predictable itching that punctuates sleep like a slow, irregular drumbeat. This is the wakeful hour, the time between the first and second sleep, when the medieval world stirs briefly into consciousness without fully abandoning the realm of rest. It is neither night nor morning, but something suspended between them are, time when the boundaries between sleeping and waking become fluid, when prayer and dream intermingle, when the body rests, but the mind drifts in that peculiar state of awareness that belongs neither to day nor night. In the monastery dormitory, Brother Francis surfaces from sleep as if rising through water, his consciousness returning gradually to the narrow bed and scratchy blanket that had become the boundaries of his nighttime world. The transition from dream to waking brings with it a moment of confusion. He reaches briefly for his wife's warmth before remembering that she lies buried in the churchyard, that his marriage bed has been replaced by this monastic cot, that his life has been divided into before and after by grief and the vows that followed in grief's wake. The dormitory around him participates in its own version of the wakeful hour. Brother Thomas, in the bed adjacent to his, continues his soft snoring, but near the window Brother Matthew sits up quietly, his movements careful not to disturb his sleeping brothers. Brother Matthew has been assigned the responsibility of waking the community for matins, the midnight prayer that punctuates the night's rest, and his internal clock has stirred him to wakefulness with the reliability that comes from 20 years of monastic routine. Brother Matthew rises from his bed, his bare feet finding the cold stone floor, with the practiced silence of a man who has learned to move through darkness without disturbing others. The stone floor, which absorbs and holds the day's warmth during the summer months, now in autumn's grip, remains stubbornly cold regardless of the season, and Brother Matthew feels the chill travel up through his feet and into his bones with each step toward the dormitory door. He pauses there, listening to the breathing of his brothers, mentally counting the forms beneath their rough brown blankets to ensure that all are present and accounted for. This counting is habit rather than necessity. The monastic community is small enough that any absence would be noticed immediately, but it provides comfort in the way that familiar routines always do, creating order in the uncertain space between sleep and prayer. The monastery chapel. When Brother Matthew enters it carrying his small oil lamp, exists in that peculiar state of sacred emptiness that characterizes religious spaces in the deep hours of the night. The single candle that burns continuously before the altar provides the only light, its flame dancing in the draughts that find their way through even the most carefully constructed stone walls. The dancing light creates shifting patterns on the carved wooden crucifix, making the figure of Christ appear to move slightly, as if breathing in rhythm with the flame itself. Brother Matthew genuflexed before the altar, his knee finding the worn stone that countless others have touched in the same gesture of reverence, and begins the quiet preparations for matins. The prayer books, bound in leather that has grown soft with handling, rest on the wooden lectern where he left them after Vespers. The pages, illuminated by patient scribes in distant monasteries, catch the candlelight and seem to glow with their own inner luminescence. Back in the village, the wakeful hour spreads its gentle influence through cottage after cottage. In the weaver's house, Eleanor stirs from sleep, her body responding to some internal signal that has learned to recognize this transitional time. Walter continues his steady snoring beside her, the sound having deepened into the more substantial rumbling that will persist until dawn. But Eleanor finds herself surfacing into the quiet awareness that characterizes this between time. She lies still for several moments, listening to the night sounds that surround her family's sleep, her mother-in-law's irregular breathing from her pallet near the dying hearth, the soft rustling of her son's shifting position in their shared bed, the distant sound of someone coughing in one of the neighboring cottages. These sounds, layered over Walter's rhythmic snoring, create a symphony of human rest that speaks to the communal nature of medieval sleep, where privacy is luxury and solitude is often indistinguishable from loneliness. Eleanor's bladder, having accumulated the night's collection of filtered liquid, begins to assert its need for attention with the polite but insistent pressure that cannot be long ignored. This necessity, while inconvenient, is also familiar. The human body maintains its own schedule regardless of sleep's demands, and the wakeful hour often coincides with such physical requirements. She rises carefully from the bed, her movements slow and deliberate to avoid disturbing Walter, though his snoring suggests that such caution may be unnecessary. The floor, covered with rushes that have begun to compress and mat together after several months of use, feels cold and slightly damp beneath her bare feet. The rushes, scattered fresh in the play spring and replaced only when they become too compressed to provide any cushioning, emit a faint vegetal scent that mingles with the other domestic aromas of the cottage. Old cooking fires, wool blankets, and the indefinable smell of human habitation that accumulates in any space where people eat and sleep and live in close quarters. The cottage door, when Eleanor opens it carefully to minimize the creaking of hinges that have never known the luxury of regular oiling, reveals the village sleeping under a sky that has begun to show the first faint suggestion of the coming dawn, though true morning remains hours away. The air outside carries the coolness of autumn nights, touched with moisture from the stream that runs past the mill and fragrant with the earthier aromas of fields where crops have been harvested and the stubble left to decay into next year's fertility. The privy, located at a discreet distance from the cottage in accordance with both practicality and social convention, requires a brief journey across the yard that serves multiple village families. Eleanor moves carefully in the darkness, her feet familiar with the path, but cautious of the small obstacles that accumulate in any well-used space. Tools left temporarily out of place, puddles from the afternoon's rain, the occasional chicken that has escaped from its coop and chosen to spend the night in the open air. The privy itself, a simple wooden structure built over a pit that will need attention before the next winter, offers little in the way of comfort, but serves its essential purpose. The wooden seat, worn smooth by years of use, retains the day's chill and reminds Eleanor's body that this is not a place for lingering. The necessity completed quickly, she makes her way back toward the cottage, pausing in the doorway to listen to the sounds of the night around her. From the monastery comes the soft sound of the bell being rung for matins not the full, resonant pealing that calls the village to Sunday Mass, but the gentler striking that summons the brothers to their midnight prayer without disturbing the sleep of the surrounding community. The sound carries clearly in the still air, a bronze voice speaking to the faithful, who have chosen to divide their nights between sleep and prayer. Brother Francis, awakened by the soft chiming, rises from his narrow bed and joins the silent procession of his brothers moving toward the chapel. The stone floor of the dormitory corridor feels like ice against his bare feet, but this discomfort, like so many others in monastic life, is accepted as part B of the price paid for spiritual devotion. The cold serves as a reminder of the body's mortality, of the temporary nature of physical comfort, of the higher purposes that transcend the simple needs of flesh and bone. The chapel, as the brothers file in carrying their individual oil lamps, fills with the warm, golden light that has illuminated midnight prayers for countless generations before them. The light dances off the stone walls, creating shifting patterns that seem to breathe with the flames themselves. Each brother takes his appointed place in the wooden stalls that line the chapel's nave. The carved seats, worn smooth by decades of use and polished to a soft gleam by the countless hours of prayer they have supported, Brother Francis, still adjusting to the rhythms of monastic life, fumbles briefly with his prayer book in the flickering light. The pages, copied by hand in a scriptorium far from this small monastery, bear the careful script of monks who dedicated their lives to preserving the words of prayer and scripture. The Latin text, familiar from years of attendance at Mass, but still challenging to read in the uncertain light, seems to swim before his tired eyes. Domini labia me, Apery's brother Matthew intones, his voice carrying easily through the stone-walled chapel. The words, ancient as the church itself, begin the formal structure of matins, dividing the night's prayer into the measured rhythm of psalm and antiphon, reading and response. The other brothers join their voices to his, creating a harmony that is less about musical beauty than about communal devotion. Though beauty emerges from the sincerity of their offering, the Latin words, repeated night after night, year after year, decade after decade, have worn smooth grooves in the brothers' minds, creating pathways for prayer that function even when consciousness drifts between sleeping and waking. Brother Francis finds his voice joining the familiar cadences, though part of his mind wanders to memories of his wife's voice, saying her own prayers in the French-influenced English of their region. Prayers learned not from Latin books, but from her mother's lips and her grandmother's before that. In the village, the sound of the monastery bell and the distant murmur of prayer create a gentle background to the wakeful hours' quiet stirrings. Thomas the carpenter, still lying in his bed but no longer truly asleep, listens to the familiar sounds and finds comfort in their regularity. The brothers' devotion to their midnight prayers provides a kind of spiritual security to the surrounding community, a sense that someone maintains vigil while others rest, that prayers are being offered on behalf of all who sleep. Little Anne, in the bed between her parents, stirs briefly at some dream disturbance, her small hand reaching out to find her mother's arm. Margaret, surfacing from her own light sleep, responds instinctively to her daughter's movement, her hand finding the child's head and smoothing the braided hair that has begun to work loose from its nighttime plaiting. The touch seems to satisfy whatever need drove Anne's brief waking, and she settles back into the deeper rhythms of child sleep, her breathing returning to the soft regularity that speaks of dreams untroubled by the adult awareness of life's complexities. Margaret remains awake for several minutes after her daughter's return to sleep, her hand resting lightly on Anne's head, listening to the night sounds that surround their family's rest. Thomas's breathing beside her has settled into the steady rhythm that she knows will continue until dawn, and she finds comfort in the familiar sound. The marriage bed, narrow and shared with their child, might seem crowded to those accustomed to greater space, but to Margaret it represents security, the warmth of shared body heat, the comfort of familiar breathing, the knowledge that her family sleeps safely within the circle of her awareness. The monastery prayers continue their ancient rhythm in the chapel, the brothers' voices rising and falling with the prescribed pattern of psalm and antiphon. Brother Francis, finding his place more surely now in the familiar structure of matins, allows his voice to join the communal offering. while his mind drifts in the peculiar state of awareness that characterizes this. The Latin words carry meanings, both specific and general, petition and praise, confession and thanksgiving, but they also serve as a kind of spiritual breathing, marking time in measured inhalations and exhalations of prayer. Telusis ante terminum, the brothers chant, the ancient hymn for nighttime prayer flowing from their lips with the ease of long practice. The words speak of protection through the darkness, of divine guardianship over those who sleep, of the light that persists even in the deepest night. Brother Francis finds meaning in these familiar phrases that extends beyond their literal translation. They speak to his condition as a man suspended between his old life and his new calling, between the grief that brought him to the monastery and the peace he hopes to find within its walls. In the cottage where the miller's family sleeps, young Peter lies awake, listening to the sound of the mill wheel turning in the stream below their window. The wheel continues its slow rotation, even at night, powered by the steady flow of water that never pauses for human convenience. The rhythmic creaking has become so familiar that Peter normally sleeps through it without awareness. But in this wakeful hour, the sound penetrates his consciousness with hypnotic regularity, speaking of the endless cycle of work that defines their lives as surely as the seasons define the year. The sound of the mill wheel mingles with his father's deep breathing from the larger bed across the room, creating a duet of mechanical and human rhythm that speaks to the interconnected nature of their lives. The miller's work depends upon the stream's flow, just as the stream's power finds purpose in the miller's wheel, just as the grain that passes through the mill stones feeds the village that supports the miller's family. These connections, invisible during the busy daylight hours, seem clearer in the contemplative quiet of the wakeful hour. Peter's stomach contracts briefly, reminding him that supper was bread and thin porridge, as it has been for many nights when the milling brings in barely enough to keep flour in their storage bins and fuel in their hearth. The hunger is not acute. He has known true emptiness during the lean months before harvest, but it serves as a persistent background reminder of the precarious balance between sufficiency and want that governs their lives. His younger sister, sleeping between their parents in the larger bed, makes soft sounds in her sleep that might be the beginning of words, or might be simply the musical nonsense that fills infant dreams. Their mother, Margaret, the miller's wife, responds to these sounds with the automatic alertness that comes to women who have learned to monitor their children's needs even while sleeping. Her hand moves instinctively to touch the baby's back, checking for the steady breathing that confirms all is well, before she too settles back into the light awareness of the wakeful hour. Across the village, in the stone house where Sir Edmund makes his residence, the night's progression follows its own elevated pattern. The stone walls, which provide better protection from weather and sound than the timber and wattle constructions of the village, also create their own particular challenges. Moisture condenses on the cold stone surfaces, creating a perpetual dampness that no amount of heating seems entirely able to eliminate. The floors, paved with stone rather than covered with rushes, retain the day's chill long after the sun has set, making nighttime journeys a test of determination as much as necessity. Lady Eleanor, lying in her linen nightgown beneath blankets of finer wool than any owned by the villagers, finds herself awakened not by external sounds, but by the persistent itching that accompanies her ongoing battle against the lice that seem to regard human heads as their natural habitat. The lavender and pennyroyal mixture she applied before sleep has created a pleasant herbal scent, but its effectiveness against the tiny creatures remains questionable. She scratches carefully, trying not to wake her husband, though Sir Edmund's sleep appears deep enough to withstand minor disturbances. The luxury of their elevated position comes with its own discomforts. The carved bed frame, while impressive to look upon, creaks with every movement in ways that the simpler rope frame beds of the villagers do not. The feather mattress, stuffed with down from geese, raised specifically for this purpose, has compressed overnight into valleys and hills that require constant adjustment to maintain any semblance of comfort. Even privilege, it seems, cannot entirely overcome the basic challenges of medieval sleeping arrangements. Their son Richard, in his small, adjacent chamber, lies awake in the darkness, wrestling with thoughts that seem too large for his 17-year-old mind. The privacy of his own sleeping space, a luxury unknown to the village children, sometimes seems more burden than blessing during these wakeful hours. Without the comforting presence of shared breathing, without the background symphony of family life, his thoughts turn inward to contemplate the complexities that await him as he approaches full adulthood. The political uncertainties that affect his father's position as steward create ripples of anxiety that reach even into Richard's protected world. He has overheard conversations between his parents about changes in the Lord's favor, about shifting alliances among the local nobility, about the delicate balance of relationships that determine their family's continued prosperity. These adult concerns, glimpsed but not fully understood, create a sense of unease that finds particular potency in the quiet hours of the night. In the cottage where the widow Alice lives alone, the wakeful hour brings its own particular character. The silence, unbroken by the breathing of family members, seems deeper and more complete than the communal quiet of the other dwellings. Alice, accustomed now to sleeping without background rhythm of another person's presence, finds this solitude both peaceful and somehow hollow, like a familiar song with half its notes missing. She rises from her bed, her aging joints protesting the movement with the accumulated complaints of 63 years of physical labor, and moves carefully toward the dying embers of her small fire. The cottage, smaller than those that house families, loses heat quickly once the flames burn low, and Alice has learned to tend her fire with the careful attention of someone who cannot afford to waste fuel or endure unnecessary coal. The wooden crucifix on the wall above her bed seems to regard her nocturnal activities with patient benediction, its carved features softened by the dim glow from the hearth. Alice whispers a brief prayer as she adds a small piece of carefully hoarded wood to the coals. Not the formal Latin of the monastery prayers, but the simple English petition that her mother taught her decades ago. Lord, keep me through this night, by and bring me safe to morning light. The prayer, worn smooth by countless repetitions, provides comfort beyond its literal meaning. It connects her to the long chain of women who have spoken these words before her, her mother, her grandmother, and all the generations of widows who have tended solitary fires in the deep hours of the night. The words serve as a reminder that even in solitude, she participates in the larger community of faith that transcends the boundaries of individual dwellings. Back in the monastery chapel, the brothers continue their progression through the prescribed prayers of matins, their voices creating harmonies that rise toward the stone-vaulted ceiling like incense. Brother Francis, finding his rhythm now in the familiar structure of psalm and antiphon, allows his consciousness to drift in that peculiar state of awareness that belongs neither to sleep nor full waking. The Latin words wash over him like water, carrying meanings both specific and mysterious, connecting him to the centuries of monks who have offered these same prayers in the same dark hours. Nunc dimittis servum tuum, Domini, the brothers chant, the ancient canticle that speaks of peaceful departure. Do 'tis fulfilled, of rest granted after labor. The words, originally spoken by the aged Simeon upon seeing the infant Christ, take on particular resonance in this between time, when the day's work is ended but the night's rest remains incomplete. When the brothers stand suspended between their earthly duties and their heavenly aspirations, Brother Matthew, leading the prayers from his position at the lecterns, feels the familiar satisfaction that comes from fulfilling this ancient responsibility. The rhythm of monastic life, with its regular divisions of prayer and work, eating and fasting, creates a framework within which the brothers can pursue their spiritual development with the same methodical approach that a craftsman brings to his trade. The midnight prayers, while demanding sacrifice of sleep's comfort, provide an anchor point around which the rest of the day's activities can be organized. The monastery bell tower, silent now until the next call to prayer, stands sentinel over the village as the wakeful hour reaches its gentle climax. The bronze bell, cast in a foundry 2 counties away and transported here at considerable expense when the monastery was founded, has witnessed countless repetitions of this nighttime drama. It has called generations of monks to prayer, has marked the passage of seasons and years with its measured voice, has served as the audible heartbeat of the community's spiritual life. In the village below, the wakeful hour begins to fade as gradually as it arrived. Thomas the carpenter, having listened to the distant sound of monastic prayer and found comfort in its familiar rhythm, feels his consciousness beginning to drift back toward the deeper currents of sleep. The drop of water from the leaking roof continues its slow accumulation. Above him, preparing for its next inevitable descent into Margaret's strategically placed bowl, but the sound no longer penetrates his awareness with the same clarity. Margaret, after checking once more on little Anne's peaceful breathing, allows her own body to relax back into the hollow worn by countless nights of shared sleep. The straw beneath them rustles and settles into a new configuration, and somewhere within the coarse wool of their shared blanket, tiny creatures continue their eternal feast. But these sensations fade into the background as the second sleep approaches with its promise of deeper rest. In the weaver's cottage, Eleanor returns from her necessary journey to the privy and settles back into bed beside Walter, whose snoring has maintained its steady rhythm throughout her absence. The cold night air that clung to her nightgown during her outdoor expedition gradually warms against her skin, and she finds comfort in the familiar scratch of the wool blanket and the reliable presence of her sleeping family around her. Young William and his brother Geoffrey, in their shared bed, have unconsciously adjusted their positions during the wakeful hours' quiet stirrings, finding new arrangements that promise greater comfort for the remaining hours of darkness. The sharp stem of straw that had been troubling William has finally been pressed into submission, and Geoffrey has discovered an angle for his arm that will allow blood to flow freely without putting pressure on his shoulder. These small victories over discomfort seem disproportionately important in the transition between wakefulness and sleep. The village cat that battle-scarred Tom, who belongs to everyone and no one, completes his nocturnal patrol of the alleyways and settles into a sheltered spot beneath the eaves of the baker's cottage, where the warmth from the banked bread ovens provides a marginally more comfortable resting place than the open ground. His presence goes unnoticed by the human inhabitants, though his soft padding and occasional rustle of disturbed leaves have provided a subtle background to the wakeful hours' quiet symphony. Brother Francis, as the monastery prayers draw toward their conclusion, feels the familiar sense of spiritual completion that comes from participating in this ancient ritual. The Latin words, initially challenging to his tired mind, have found their rhythm and meaning, connecting him to the long tradition of midnight prayer that stretches back through centuries of monastic devotion. The chapel, filled with the warm, golden light of the brothers' individual lamps, seems to glow with accumulated holiness, as if the thousands of prayers offered within its walls have left some lingering presence that transcends the physical boundaries of stone and wood. In pace dormiam et requiem, brother, Matthew concludes, speaking the words that will carry the brothers back to their narrow beds and scratchy blankets with the blessing of prayer fulfilled. The phrase, speaking of peaceful sleep and restful slumber, acknowledges the human need for physical rest even within the context of spiritual discipline. It recognizes that the body's requirements must be met before the soul can pursue its higher purposes, that sleep itself can be a form of prayer when approached with the proper reverence. The night air continues its slow circulation through the village, carrying scents and sounds from dwelling to dwelling, mixing the breath of sleepers with the smoke of dying fires, and the earthier aromas of the agricultural life that defines the boundaries between human habitation and the natural world beyond. The air grows cooler as the night advances, touched with the first hint of the frost that will arrive in the weeks ahead. But within the cottages and the monastery dormitory, shared body heat and banked fires maintain sufficient warmth for comfortable rest. Thomas the carpenter's breathing deepens into the profound rhythms of the second sleep, and beside him Margaret and little Anne surrender once again to the deeper currents of rest. The drop of water gathering overhead will continue its patient accumulation and inevitable descent, but the sound will no longer penetrate the household's sleeping awareness. The village settles around them like a familiar blanket, heavy with the accumulated comfort of routine and the blessing of shared rest. The monastery bell tower stands watch over the sleeping community, its bronze voice silent now until the next call to prayer. The continuous candle in the chapel burns steadily before the altar, its flame dancing in the draughts but never failing, maintaining its vigil while monks and villagers alike surrender to the deeper mercy of the second sleep. And so the wakeful hour passes, as it has passed for countless nights before, and will pass for countless nights to come. Tear the brief stirring of consciousness, the gentle acknowledgement of the body's needs, the quiet prayers and comfortable adjustments, all fade back into the larger rhythm of the night's rest. The village breathes as one great organism, drawing the cool night air into collective lungs and exhaling the warmth of shared life. The scratchy wool settles against skin. The straw compresses into new configurations of comfort. The small creatures continue their invisible feast within blankets and mattresses. Someone coughs once and returns to silence. Someone scratches briefly at an itch and continues sleeping. The night sounds blend into their familiar symphony of rest continuing. The second sleep spreads its deeper blessing over cottage and monastery, noble and peasant, young and old, carrying them all toward, mourning on the profound current of dreams and darkness, breath and silence, the scratch of wool and the whisper of straw, the comfort of shared warmth and the peace that comes when consciousness finally releases its gentle grip on the waking world. The village sleeps again, more deeply now, blessed by prayer and the mercy of rest twice given. Pat, and the night drifts on, patient and eternal, cradling them all in its ancient embrace. The fire dies, feet twitch under damp wool. No one remembers how they slept. The second sleep comes like a tide that has been gathering strength far from shore, rolling in with the quiet inevitability of natural law. In the village of Millhaven, where the wakeful hour has performed its gentle interlude of prayer and necessity, consciousness now ebbs away more completely than before, drawn down into depths that the first sleep, for all its mercy, had not quite reached. This is the profound rest that comes in the deepest part of the night, when the body admits its full surrender to the demands of restoration, and the mind releases even its lightest hold on the waking world. In the cottage where Thomas the carpenter has settled back into sleep, after the brief stirring that marked the between time, the quality of rest has changed like water that has found a deeper channel. His breathing, which during the first sleep maintained some connection to conscious control, now follows rhythms that belong entirely to the body's automatic wisdom. The rise and fall of his chest beneath the scratchy wool blanket speaks of systems functioning without oversight, of repairs being made to muscle and sinew, that have carried him through another day of physical labor. Margaret, lying beside him in the hollow worn by countless nights of shared sleep, has also descended into this deeper current of rest. Her body, which during the wakeful hour maintained its maternal alertness, too, little Anne's movements and sounds, now trusts the child's sleep completely and allows itself the luxury of total restoration. The unconscious adjustments that mothers make throughout the night, the slight shift to accommodate a restless child, the automatic response to changes in breathing patterns, continue but operate now at levels so deep that consciousness plays no part in their execution. Little Anne, pressed between her parents in the narrow bed, sleeps with a profound abandon that comes naturally to the young, but must be reclaimed each night by those whose years have taught them the weight of responsibility and worry. Her small body generates surprising amounts of heat, despite her delicate frame, and this warmth spreads through the shared bed like a blessing, creating the microclimate of comfort that makes medieval sleeping arrangements bearable despite their apparent hardships. The child's dreams, if indeed the very young experience dreams as adults understand them, seem to play themselves out in subtle movements of her limbs and face. Occasionally her fingers twitch as if grasping something precious, or her lips move silently around words that belong to no waking language. These movements, slight as they are, disturb neither parent, for the second sleep has claimed them too completely for such minor disturbances to penetrate their awareness. The cottage around them participates in its own version of the second sleep, the timber frame settling into the profound stillness that comes to wooden structures in the deepest hours of the night. The sounds of expansion and contraction that mark the daily cycle of heating and cooling have largely ceased, leaving only the occasional soft groan of wood adjusting to moisture changes in the night air. Even the mice, those eternal companions of human habitation, seem to have found their own rest, their scurrying reduced to the occasional soft rustle that speaks more of dreaming than deliberate movement. The drop of water that had marked the beginning of Thomas's wakeful hour continues its patient accumulation in the sagging beam overhead, but its eventual descent into Margaret's wooden bowl will find no conscious witness. The second sleep has drawn the household too deeply into rest for such minor disturbances to register in awareness. The sound, when it comes, will join the soft symphony of night noises that accompany profound sleep without disturbing it. In the monastery dormitory, Brother Francis has found his way into this deeper current of rest, with the gratitude of a man who has learned not to take peaceful sleep for granted. The narrow bed, the scratchy brown blanket, the thin straw mattressole, the discomforts that marked his initial transition to monastic life, have been temporarily forgotten in the mercy of the second sleep. His body, which still sometimes reaches in sleep for his wife's warmth, now lies still and completely relaxed, surrendering to the restoration that can only come when consciousness steps aside entirely. The dormitory around him breathes with the collective rhythm of sleeping monks, each man lost in his own profound rest, yet somehow participating in the communal experience of shared slumber. Brother Thomas, in the adjacent bed, has progressed beyond his earlier soft snoring into the complete silence that marks the deepest phase of sleep. His breathing, barely audible, follows patterns so slow and deep that each inhalation seems to draw from some inexhaustible well of peace. Brother Matthew, who led the community through Matins just hours earlier, now experiences the profound rest that comes to those who have fulfilled their spiritual obligations and can surrender completely to sleep's embrace. His internal clock, so reliable in waking him for prayer, now releases its vigilance and allows his consciousness to drift in the timeless realm where hours have no meaning and responsibility exists only as a distant memory. The monastery chapel, empty now, except for the continuous candle that burns before the altar, holds within its stone walls the lingering resonance of the prayers that echoed there during the wakeful hour. The Latin words impacidur meo et heciescam seem to have taken on physical presence, creating an atmosphere of benediction that extends beyond the chapel's boundaries to bless the sleep of all who rest within the monastery's walls. The candle itself, its flame dancing steadily in the draughts that find their way through ancient stone, serves as a kind of lighthouse for the sleeping community, though no one watches its light during these deep hours. Its presence maintains the connection between the human need for rest and the divine vigilance that never sleeps. The flame's persistence through the night speaks to continuities that transcend individual consciousness, to the ongoing work of faith that continues even when the faithful surrender to the necessity of physical restoration. In the village cottages, the second sleep claims its inhabitants with the same thoroughness that marks the monastery's rest. Walter, the weaver, whose earlier snoring had provided a steady background to his family's first sleep, now breathes so quietly that his wife Eleanor might worry about his continued existence if her own consciousness were present to notice the change. But she too has descended into the profound depths of the second sleep, her body finally releasing the tensions that accumulate during days spent spinning wool into thread and managing the countless details of household life. Their sons, Geoffrey and young William, share their narrow bed in the complete unconsciousness that comes to growing boys whose bodies demand rest for the complex work of development. The sharp stem of straw that had troubled William during the wakeful hour no longer registers in his awareness, and Geoffrey's arm has found an angle that allows circulation to flow freely throughout the remaining hours of darkness. These small victories over discomfort, so important in the transition toward sleep, now seem as distant as memories from childhood. The cottage itself, like all the village dwellings, has settled into the deep stillness that characterizes the hours between midnight and dawn. The sounds of daily life, the creak of footsteps on wooden floors, the rustle of movement through rooms, the soft conversation that accompanies shared domestic tasks have given way to the subtler symphony of a building at rest. Occasionally a timber beam releases a soft sigh as wood fibers adjust to the night's cooling. But these sounds belong more to the realm of dreams than waking awareness. In the stone house where Sir Edmund makes his residence, the second sleep brings its own particular character. The stone walls, which during the day absorb and hold heat from sun and fire, now radiate coolness. That makes the night air within the dwelling distinctly chilly despite the banked fires. Lady Eleanor, beneath her fine linen sheets and wool blankets, has unconsciously drawn herself into a tighter configuration that conserves body heat, while still allowing circulation to reach her extremities. The carved bed frame, which during the first sleep had protested each movement with creaks and groans, profound stillness of deep slumber. Sir Edmund's breathing has settled into rhythms, so slow and regular that they seem more like the measured pulse of some great clock than the respiratory patterns of a living man. Even the lice that had troubled Lady Eleanor's sleep earlier have found their own rest, their tiny bodies following biological rhythms that parallel, in their own microscopic way, the larger patterns of rest and activity that govern all living things. Their son, Richard, in his small adjacent chamber, has finally found release from the anxious thoughts that had kept him wakeful during the between time. The political uncertainties that affect his father's position, the complex relationships among the local nobility, the gradual dawning awareness of adult responsibilities, these concerns have been temporarily dissolved in the merciful forgetfulness that accompanies the second sleep. His 17-year-old body, suspended between the easy rest of childhood and the more troubled sleep that comes with full adult awareness, surrenders completely to the restoration that only profound slumber can provide. The privacy of his own sleeping space, which sometimes seems more burden than blessing during the wakeful hours, now provides the perfect environment for the deep rest his developing body requires, without the distraction of shared breathing or the need to accommodate others' movements. Richard can sleep with the complete abandon that will prepare him for whatever challenges the coming day may bring. Till, in the cottage where the widow Alice lives alone, the second sleep brings a different quality of rest, deeper perhaps than what she knew during her married years, when part of her consciousness always remained alert to her husband's breathing and movements. The solitude that sometimes feels like emptiness during the wakeful hours now provides the perfect conditions for profound restoration, allowing her aging body to direct all its energy toward the complex work of cellular repair and renewal that can only occur during the deepest phases of sleep. Alice's small cottage, unheated now, except for the dying coals in her carefully tended hearth, grows progressively cooler as the night advances, but her body, wise with the experience of 63 years, has learned to generate sufficient warmth for comfortable rest. The woolen cloak she pulls over her regular blanket creates multiple layers of insulation that trap body heat, while allowing enough air circulation to prevent the stuffy atmosphere that can disturb sleep. The wooden crucifix on the wall above her bed, invisible now in the complete darkness that follows the dying of the fire, nonetheless maintains its silent benediction over her rest. The prayers she whispered before surrendering to sleep's simple English petitions, rather than the formal Latin of monastic tradition, have created their own atmosphere of peace that extends beyond conscious awareness into the realm of dreams and deeper restoration. The village, around all these sleeping forms, has assumed the profound quiet that belongs uniquely to the deepest hours of the night. The sounds of human activity conversation, footsteps. The movement of tools and utensils have ceased entirely, leaving only the subtler voices of the natural world, the distant flow of the stream that powers the mill wheel, the soft rustle of wind through the harvested fields, the occasional call of a night bird following instincts older than human memory. Even the domestic animals seem to participate in this deeper phase of rest. The cattle in the common field lie with the patient stillness of creatures whose consciousness operates on rhythms different from human awareness. Their breathing creating small clouds of vapor in the cooling air. The chickens, secured in their coops against the nocturnal predators that prowl the village margins, roost with the complete stillness that comes to birds whose entire existence depends upon the fine balance between rest and vigilance. The village cat, that battle-scarred Tom who belongs to everyone and no one, has found a sheltered spot beneath the eaves of the miller's cottage, where warmth from the building's interior creates a marginally more comfortable resting place. His sleep, lighter than human slumber, but still profound by feline standards, allows him to remain alert to the small sounds that might indicate either opportunity or danger, while still providing the restoration his body requires. The mill wheel itself continues its slow rotation in the stream below Peter's window, powered by the steady flow of water that never pauses for human convenience. But the sound, which during the wakeful hour had penetrated Peter's consciousness with hypnotic regularity, now serves only as a distant lullaby that deepens rather than disturbs the household's rest. The mechanical rhythm blends with the natural sounds of flowing water and wind through trees, creating a symphony of continuity that speaks to the eternal cycles that govern both human and natural life. Young Peter, in the bed he shares with his brothers, sleeps with the profound abandon that comes to children whose bodies are growing rapidly and require extensive restoration. His hunger, noticeable during the wakeful hour when consciousness could register the empty feeling in his stomach, has been temporarily forgotten in the mercy of deep sleep. The body's wisdom redirects energy from digestion and conscious awareness toward the complex processes of growth and repair that can only occur during the deepest phases of rest. His father, the miller himself, maintains the steady breathing that speaks of a man whose work demands physical strength, and who has learned to recover that strength through complete surrender to sleep's restorative power. The flower dust that permanently clings to his hair and clothes, despite evening washings, seems to settle more deeply during these profound hours, becoming part of the very essence of his being, rather than simply an occupational hazard. Margaret, the miller's wife, with their baby daughter sleeping between herself and her husband, has descended into the kind of deep rest that allows her body to produce the milk that sustains their youngest child. The complex biochemical processes that support nursing continue automatically during sleep, drawing from her body's reserves to create the nourishment that will support new life. This biological imperative operates below the level of consciousness, testimony to the remarkable wisdom of systems that function without conscious oversight. The baby herself sleeps with the complete trust that comes to those who have not yet learned that the world contains uncertainties and dangers. Her breathing so soft it barely stirs the air around her, follows patterns that seem to echo some distant memory of the worm's perfect security. Occasionally, her small hands curl and uncurl, as if grasping something precious in her dreams, or her lips make small sucking motions that speak to the simple needs and satisfactions that define infant existence. Throughout the village, the second sleep works its profound restoration on bodies that have spent the day in physical labor and minds that have grappled with the complex challenges of medieval life, muscles that have lifted and carried, hands that have spun and woven, backs that have bent over countless tasks, all surrender to the healing processes that can only occur when consciousness steps aside completely. The scratchy wool blankets that earlier seemed to emphasize discomfort now provide exactly the right texture to remind sleeping bodies of security and warmth. The straw mattresses that had poked and prodded during the transition toward sleep now offer support that allows muscles to relax completely without losing the alignment necessary for comfortable rest. Even the shared sleeping arrangements that might seem crowded to modern sensibilities now reveal their advantages. Shared body heat creates perfect microclimates for rest, and the rhythm of others' breathing provides the most natural and comforting lullaby imaginable. Brother Francis, in his monastery cell, experiences this second sleep as a gift beyond prize the temporary, forgetfulness of grief and loss that allows his body and spirit to find restoration. The monastic routine, with its division between prayer and rest, work and contemplation, creates the perfect framework within which such healing can occur. The scratchy brown blanket and thin straw mattress, initially experienced as hardships to be endured, now seem exactly suited to the simple needs of a man who has learned to find sufficiency in basics rather than luxury in excess. The monastery dormitory breathes with the collective rhythm of men who have found peace through surrender to routine, to community, to the ancient wisdom that governs monastic life. Each brother's individual rest contributes to the communal experience of shared slumber, creating an atmosphere of collective peace that transcends the simple sum of individual sleep. The stone walls that surround them, worn smooth by centuries of weather and blessed by countless prayers, seem to exhale their own benediction over the sleeping community. As the night advances toward its deepest point, that moment when dawn remains equally distant, whether measured forward or backward, the second sleep reaches its most profound depths. This is the time when the body performs its most essential restoration work, when cells repair themselves and memories consolidate into permanent storage, when the immune system strengthens itself against future challenges, and the spirit finds renewal for the struggles that await with morning light. The village exists now in a state of suspended animation, its inhabitants so completely claimed by sleep that they seem more like peaceful statues than living human beings. Breathing slows to its minimum necessary rate. Heart rates drop to their most efficient rhythms, and brain activity settles into the deep patterns that allow consciousness to rest, while essential functions continue their automatic operation. This is the sleep that medieval people understood as a kind of death knot, the permanent cessation of life, but the temporary withdrawal of consciousness that allows the body to remember its essential nature and perform the repairs that daily life makes necessary. It is the sleep that comes closest to the final rest, and therefore the sleep that brings the most complete restoration to those who surrender to its embrace. The fire in Alice's cottage burns down to its last coals, the small red glow, providing just enough warmth to maintain comfort without wasting precious fuel. The monastery candle continues its vigil before the altar, its flame steady and unwavering despite the draughts that stir the air in the stone chapel. Throughout the village, the carefully banked fires settle into the slow combustion that will preserve some warmth until morning, while consuming the minimum necessary wood. Even these small lights the dying coals, the steady candle flame. The occasional star visible through gaps in the cloud cover seem to participate in the profound stillness that marks the second sleep's deepest phase. They burn without urgency, providing illumination for no conscious observer, maintaining their vigil over a world that has temporarily suspended its conscious activities in favor of the more essential work of restoration and renewal. The night air moves through the village with the gentleness of breath itself, carrying scents and moisture from cottage to cottage, mixing the exhalations of sleepers with the smoke from dying fires and the earthier aromas of agricultural life. The air seems to move more slowly during these deep hours, as if it too participates in the general suspension of activity that characterizes the second sleep. And in this profound quiet, something approaches that no sleeper anticipates, and none will remember clearly upon waking. The second sleep, for all its mercy and restoration, will fade like dreams fade, leaving behind only the general sense of having been blessed with rest. The specific quality of this deep peace, the particular texture of complete surrender to sleep's embrace, will vanish with the first stirring of dawn consciousness, remembered only as a vague sense of having slept well. But for now, in this suspended moment between night and morning, between consciousness and oblivion, the village rests in the perfect peace that comes to those who have learned to trust in sleep's ancient wisdom. The scratchy wool settles against skin like a blessing. The straw compresses into configurations of perfect support. The shared warmth creates exactly the right temperature for restoration. The second sleep claims them all peasant and noble, monk and widow, parent and child, with the complete impartiality that marks sleep as one of humanity's most democratic experiences. In sleep, all are equally vulnerable and equally blessed, all equally dependent on the body's automatic wisdom and equally recipients of restoration's gift. And the night drifts on, carrying them deeper into the healing darkness, toward the morning that will call them back to consciousness and responsibility, but also toward the rest that makes such waking possible. The village sleeps more profoundly now than it has slept since the previous night's second sleep. blessed by the ancient mercy that asks nothing but surrender and gives everything that tired bodies and weary spirits require. The fire dies to embers. Feet grow still under damp wool. No one will remember precisely how they slept, but all will wake knowing they have been blessed by rest's profound gift. And the second sleep waits no longer. It has arrived, claiming the village in its deepest embrace. He crows too early. Someone coughs. Someone forgets their dream. Someone never wakes. The rooster that serves the village of Millhaven belongs, in the manner of many medieval conveniences, to everyone and no one in particular. He has made his roost in the eaves of the baker's cottage, where the warmth from the bread ovens provides comfort during the cold hours before dawn, and where his proclaimed ownership of the territory goes largely unchallenged by the humans who benefit from his services. His internal clock, honed by generations of ancestral wisdom and the mysterious rhythms that govern all living things, normally announces the approaching dawn with the reliability that has made roosters indispensable to communities that lack more sophisticated timekeeping methods. But on this particular night, as the second sleep holds the village in its deepest embrace, something disturbs the rooster's usual precision. Perhaps it is the unusual brightness of the moon, which has emerged from behind the clouds that earlier veiled its light, and now casts silver illumination through the gaps in the cottage eaves. Perhaps it is some subtle shift in air pressure that speaks to senses more ancient than human understanding. Or perhaps it is simply the biological equivalent of the confusion that sometimes affects even the most reliable systems, causing them to announce events before their proper time. Whatever the cause, the rooster lifts his head in the darkness and releases the first tentative crow that will, over the next hour, gradually wake the village from its profound rest. The sound begins softly, more question than proclamation, as if the bird himself suspects that something is not quite right about the timing of his announcement. But having begun the process, he seems committed to continuing it, and his subsequent crows grow progressively stronger and more insistent, echoing off the stone walls of the monastery and the timber frames of the cottages with increasing authority. In the monastery dormitory, Brother Francis surfaces from the second sleep like a swimmer rising through deep water, his consciousness returning gradually to the narrow bed and scratchy blanket that define the boundaries of his nighttime world. The rooster's crow penetrates his awareness with the insistence of sound that carries meaning beyond mere noise, speaks to awakening, to responsibility, to the approaching end of rest's temporary mercy. But something feels wrong about the quality of darkness that greets his opening eyes, a wrongness that his body recognizes before his mind can articulate it. The dormitory around him remains wrapped in the profound quiet that characterizes the deepest hours of the night. Brother Thomas, in the adjacent bed, continues the silent breathing that marks the second sleep's most restorative phase, and from throughout the long room comes the collective rhythm of men still claimed by rest's embrace. Only Brother Matthew, whose responsibility for calling the community to prayer has trained his consciousness to respond to any disturbance of the night's routine, shows signs of stirring at the rooster's premature announcement. Brother Francis lies still for several moments, his body caught between the desire to return to sleep's forgiving depths and the growing awareness that something has interrupted the normal progression of the night. The rooster's crow, now repeated with increasing frequency, speaks to dawn's approach. But the quality of darkness visible through the dormitory windows suggests that true morning remains hours away. This temporal confusion creates a kind of spiritual disorientation, as if the natural order that governs prayer and rest has been somehow disturbed in the village cottages. The rooster's premature announcement begins to work its way through the layers of sleep that protect the inhabitants from unwanted consciousness. Thomas the carpenter, claimed so completely by the second sleep that he seems more statued than living man, stirs slightly as the sound penetrates the depths of his rest. Piss body wise, with the experience of 43 years of physical labor, recognizes that something is amiss, even before conscious thought can analyze the situation. The crow comes again, more insistent now, and Thomas's eyes open in the darkness of the loft. He shares with Margaret and little Anne. The quality of air around him speaks of deep night rather than approaching dawn. There is no hint of the subtle lightening that precedes true morning, no suggestion of the gradual warming that comes as the sun prepares to climb above the horizon. Yet the rooster continues his announcement with the authority of one who believes himself to be fulfilling his proper function. Margaret, lying beside him, responds to her husband's stirring with the automatic awareness that comes to women who have learned to monitor their family's rest even while sleeping. Her consciousness rises toward the surface of wakefulness without quite breaking through, maintaining that delicate balance between sleep and awareness that allows her to assess whether the disturbance requires her attention. Little Anne, pressed between her parents, continues the profound sleep that comes naturally to children, her small body generating warmth that spreads through the shared bed like a blessing. The cottage around them seems to hold its breath, as if the building itself recognizes the wrongness of being wakened at this hour. The timber frame, which had settled into the profound stillness that characterizes the deepest hours of night, now creaks slightly as temperature differences create minor contractions in the wood. These sounds, barely audible during normal conditions, seem amplified in the unnatural quiet that follows premature awakening. In the stone house where Sir Edmund makes his residence, the rooster's crow penetrates even the better insulation provided by the thick walls. Lady Eleanor, drawn from the second sleep's depths, experiences the same disorientation that affects her social inferiors, the sense that time has somehow become unstuck from its normal progression. Her body, which had settled into the profound relaxation that allows the most complete restoration, now tenses with the unconscious recognition that something has disrupted the night's natural rhythm. Sir Edmund, beside her in their carved bed, remains more deeply asleep, but even his rest shows signs of disturbance. His breathing, which during the second sleep had achieved the slow, deep rhythm of complete restoration, now becomes slightly more irregular. as if some part of his consciousness recognizes the temporal confusion without rising to full awareness. The stone walls that surround them seem to transmit the rooster's call with particular resonance, as if the very architecture participates in the spreading awareness that something has gone awry. Their son, Richard, in his small adjacent chamber, rises closest to full consciousness of all the household, the privacy of his sleeping space, which during the second sleep had provided perfect conditions for restoration, now becomes a kind of isolation chamber, where the prongness of the hour presses upon his awareness with particular intensity. At 17, his sleep is naturally lighter than that of his parent, and the rooster's announcement penetrates his rest with the clarity of a bell ringing in an empty church. Richard sits up in his narrow bed, his body responding to the call before his mind can fully assess the situation. The darkness around him carries none of the subtle signs that herald true Dono hint of lightning sky, no suggestion of the gradual warming that comes as night prepares to surrender to day. Yet the rooster continues his insistent proclamation, each crow more confident than the last, as if the bird's certainty could somehow transform the objective reality of the hour. In the cottage where the miller's family sleeps, to the sound of the wheel turning in the stream below, young Peter surfaces from sleep with the same gradual disorientation that affects the rest of the village. The mill wheel's rhythm, which during the second sleep had served as a distant lullaby, deepening rather than disturbing rest, now seems to carry a different message, urgent where it had been soothing, insistent where it had been peaceful. The mechanical sound blends with the rooster's crow to create a symphony of premature awakening that speaks to disruption rather than natural transition. Peter's father, the miller himself, stirs in the larger bed but does not fully wake. His body, accustomed to the physical demands of his trade and the deep rest required for restoration, resists the premature call to consciousness. But even in sleep, his breathing becomes less regular, as if some part of his awareness recognizes that the normal progression of night and day has been somehow interrupted. Margaret, the miller's wife, with their baby daughter sleeping between herself and her husband, experiences the mother's particular form of sleep disruption, the instant alertness that comes when any sound might indicate a child's need for attention. But the baby continues her profound infant slumber, untouched by the temporal confusion that affects the adults around her. The child's breathing remains soft and regular, testimony to the wisdom of systems too young to have learned that roosters sometimes lie about the hour. Pow throughout the village, the premature dawn call creates pockets of confused wakefulness. In the weaver's cottage, Eleanor stirs from the second sleep's embrace, her body responding to the rooster's announcement, even as her mind struggles to comprehend why consciousness has returned at what feels like the wrong hour. Walter, beside her, maintains his deep sleep with the stubborn determination of a man whose body has learned to extract every possible moment of restoration from the night's allotted time. Their sons, Geoffrey and young William, remain claimed by the profound sleep that comes to growing boys whose bodies require extensive restoration. The shared bed that had seemed uncomfortably narrow during the wakeful hour now provides exactly the right amount of space for two forms completely relaxed in deep slumber. The rooster's call penetrates their awareness only as distant sound that might belong to dreams rather than waking reality. But in the cottage where the widow Alice lives alone, the premature announcement finds a more receptive audience. Alice, who sleeps since her husband's death to winters past, has remained lighter than the communal rest enjoyed by families, responds to the rooster's crow with the immediate wakefulness that comes to those who have learned to rely on their own vigilance. Her aging body, which had found such perfect restoration in the second sleep's embrace, now rises toward consciousness with the reluctant acceptance of one who has grown accustomed to sleep's interruptions. She lies still for several moments in the complete darkness of her small cottage, listening to the rooster's repeated announcements and trying to reconcile the sound with the quality of night that surrounds her. The darkness carries none of the subtle changes that herald true dawn, no gradual lightening of the sky beyond her shuttered window. No suggestion of the distant stirring that comes as the natural world prepares for morning. Yet the rooster continues his proclamation with increasing confidence, as if repetition could somehow make his timing accurate. Alice rises from her bed, her joints protesting the movement with the accumulated complaints of 63 years of physical labor, and moves carefully toward the dying embers of her small fire. The cottage, which during the second sleep had seemed perfectly warm and secure, now feels cold and somehow vulnerable in the unnatural quiet that follows premature awakening. The wooden crucifix on the wall above her bed, invisible in the complete darkness, nonetheless seems to offer its silent benediction over her confused stirring. She adds a small piece of carefully hoarded wood to the coals, not because the cottage requires additional warmth, but because the act of tending fire provides comfort during this temporal displacement. The flames that catch and begin to dance cast shadows that seem different from their usual patterns, as if the light itself recognizes that it burns at the wrong hour and for the wrong reasons. In the monastery dormitory, Brother Matthew finally surrenders to the rooster's insistent call and rises from his bed to investigate the temporal confusion. His responsibility for maintaining the community's prayer schedule requires that he assess whether the bird's announcement carries any legitimacy or whether it represents simply the natural world's occasional failure to maintain perfect accuracy. The stone floor feels particularly cold beneath his bare feet, as if the building itself protests being stirred at this inappropriate hour. Brother Matthew moves carefully through the dormitory, his oil lamp creating a small pool of light that reveals the sleeping forms of his brothers. Most remain claimed by the second sleep's embrace, their breathing continuing the deep, slow rhythm that speaks of profound restoration in progress. But several show signs of disturbance, the slightly irregular breathing that indicates awareness without full consciousness, the subtle tension that comes when sleep has been interrupted, even if not completely broken. Brother Francis, in his narrow bed, watches Brother Matthew's progress with a mixed relief and resignation that comes to one who has been drawn unwillingly from sleep's embrace. The approaching light confirms what his body had already recognized, that consciousness has returned too early, that the natural rhythm of rest and waking has been somehow disrupted. The roosters crow, now joined by responding calls from other birds throughout the village, creates a growing symphony of premature dawn that speaks to confusion rather than natural order. The monastery chapel, when Brother Matthew enters it carrying his lamp, seems different from its appearance during the wakeful hours' prayers. The continuous candle still burns before the altar, its flame dancing in the draughts with the same steadiness that has marked its vigil throughout the night. But the quality of darkness that surrounds the small light speaks to deep night rather than approaching dawn, creating a temporal disconnect that makes the sacred space seem somehow displaced from normal time. Brother Matthew genuflects before the altar, his knee finding the worn stone that countless others have touched in the same gesture of reverence, and begins to assess the situation. The prayer books remain on the wooden lectern where they were left after matins, their leather bindings dark and silent in the flickering candlelight. The carved wooden crucifix, illuminated by the dancing flame, seems to regard the proceedings with the patient wisdom of one who has witnessed countless nights and knows that roosters, like humans, sometimes err in their pronouncements. Outside the chapel, the rooster's call continues with undiminished enthusiasm, now answered by similar proclamations from neighboring farms and villages. The sound carries through the night air with the clarity that comes in the deep hours when human activity has ceased, and natural sounds travel without interference. But the very clarity of the calls emphasizes their wrongness. They speak to dawn in a darkness that admits no possibility of sunrise for hours yet to come. Back in the village cottages, the growing chorus of premature dawn calls begins to work its way through even the deepest levels of sleep. Thomas the carpenter, his consciousness now hovering near the surface of wakefulness, finally admits defeat and opens his eyes fully to assess the situation. The darkness around him carries the weight and texture of deep night, yet the roosters continue their insistent announcement with the authority of creatures who believe themselves to be fulfilling their natural function. Margaret, beside him, also surrenders to wakefulness, her body responding to her husband's stirring with the automatic awareness that governs. Married couples who have shared beds for many years, little and between them continues her profound child sleep. But even her rest shows subtle signs of disturbance, like changes in breathing patterns, minor adjustments of position that speak to some subliminal awareness of the household's altered state. The cottage around them seems to participate in the general confusion, its familiar sounds taking on different qualities in the unnatural wakefulness. The drop of water that had marked earlier transitions between sleep phases continues its patient accumulation in the sagging beam overhead, but its eventual descent will find a household already stirred from rest rather than peacefully sleeping. The timber frame creaks slightly as temperature differences create minor adjustments, but these sounds now seem amplified and somehow ominous in the wrongness of premature consciousness. Throughout the village, similar scenes play out in cottage after cottage. The rooster's lie about the hour creates pockets of confused wakefulness, drawing inhabitants from the second sleep's restorative embrace into a temporal limbo, where neither true night nor actual morning provides clear guidance about proper behavior. Some, like Alice, the widow, rise fully to tend fires and assess their situation. Others, like the miller and his family, maintain an uneasy balance between sleep and waking, their bodies resisting the premature call to consciousness, while their minds struggle to comprehend the temporal displacement. In the monastery, Brother Matthew completes his assessment of the pretigiation and makes the decision that will determine the community's response to the rooster's premature announcement. The darkness beyond the chapel windows admits no possibility of legitimate dawn. Yet the bird's insistent calling has already disturbed the natural rhythm of rest that governs monastic life. The choice becomes whether to trust the evidence of the senses that declare the hour still deep night, or to respond to the rooster's call with the obedience that monastic discipline requires. Brother Matthew chooses compromise, a gentle bell ringing that acknowledges the disturbance without fully capitulating to the rooster's error. The bronze bell, when struck softly, releases a tone that carries through the monastery and village with the message that authority recognizes the temporal confusion, but does not endorse the premature claim of dawn. The sound serves as both acknowledgement and correction, admitting the rooster's announcement while maintaining the proper order of night and day. Brother Francis, listening to the gentle bell from his narrow bed, finds in its measured tone a kind of absolution for his own confused wakefulness. The sound speaks to the human understanding of temporal order, even when natural signals provide unreliable guidance. It acknowledges the rooster's error without condemnation, recognizing that even the most reliable systems sometimes fail in their appointed functions. The village responds to the monastery bell with its own subtle acknowledgments of the temporal confusion. In cottage after cottage, the partially wakened inhabitants find comfort in the bell's measured response to the situation. The sound provides authoritative guidance that neither fully endorses the rooster's claim nor completely dismisses the disturbance that has already interrupted the night's natural progression. Thomas the carpenter, listening to the bell from his shared bed, finds in its tone the permission to remain suspended between sleep and waking, until true dawn provides clear guidance about the proper response to consciousness. The bell speaks to human wisdom in the face of natural confusion, acknowledging the rooster's error while maintaining the framework within which proper rest can continue. Alice, the widow, tending her small fire in the unnatural wakefulness, hears in the monastery bell the voice of institutional wisdom addressing the temporal displacement that affects the entire community. The sound provides comfort in its recognition that the rooster's announcement, while sincere, does not carry the authority to transform night into day through simple proclamation. And so the village settles into an uneasy state of partial wakefulness, caught between the rooster's insistent lies about the hour and the evidence of darkness that surrounds them all. Some return to sleep's embrace, trusting their body's wisdom over the confused bird's announcement. Others remain partially conscious, maintaining vigil in the temporal limbo that exists between the rooster's claims and reality's contrary evidence. The rooster himself, having made his proclamation, seems content to continue his announcements regardless of their accuracy, his internal clock disturbed by whatever force created the initial confusion, now maintains its error with the stubborn consistency that characterizes all natural systems once they have committed to a particular course of action. His crows echo through the night air with undiminished confidence, as if repetition could somehow make his timing correct. In the monastery chapel, the continuous candle burns with the same steady flame that has marked its vigil throughout the night, providing the only reliable constant in a situation where temporal signals have become unreliable. The flame's persistence speaks to continuities that transcend individual confusion, to the ongoing work of faith that continues even when roosters lie about the hour and communities must navigate the space between false dawn and true morning. The night air moves through the village with the same gentleness that has characterized its circulation throughout the hours of darkness, carrying scents and sounds from dwelling to dwelling without, regard for the temporal confusion that affects the human inhabitants. The stream that powers the mill wheel continues its ancient flow, the mechanical rhythm unchanged by the rooster's premature announcements or the community's confused response to them. And in this suspended time, when the rooster's lies have disrupted the natural progression from night to morning, but true dawn has not yet arrived to provide clear guidance, the village exists in a state of temporal uncertainty that speaks to larger questions about reliability and trust, about the systems natural and human that govern the progression of time itself. Someone coughs in the darkness, the sound carrying clearly through the still air. Someone stirs and mutters words that belong neither to sleep nor full waking. Someone lies listening to the competing claims of rooster and darkness, trusting bodily wisdom over auditory announcement. And someone, perhaps, never fully wakes at all, maintaining the blessing of sleep despite the temporal confusion that surrounds them. The rooster crows again, confident in his error. The monastery bell offers its gentle correction. The village breathes in the uncertain space between false dawn and true morning, waiting for the real light that will resolve all temporal confusion and restore the proper order of night and day. Until then, they rest in the knowledge that roosters sometimes lie. But morning always comes, regardless of premature announcements or confused chronometry. The darkness holds them all, patient and eternal, cradling the community in its ancient embrace, while roosters make their false proclamations and bells offer their gentle corrections. The night continues, deeper than the rooster's claims, but not yet ready to surrender to the dawn that will come in its own time. By its own authority, with the reliability that transcends all false announcements about the hour. The floor stays warm, the wind moves east, the past falls quiet, and morning arrives again. In the gradual resolution of temporal confusion that follows the rooster's premature announcements, the village of Millhaven settles into the peculiar state of rest that comes after sleep has been interrupted but not entirely broken. The darkness that surrounded the false dawn calls slowly, lightens with such subtlety that no single moment can be identified as the transition from night to day. Instead, morning arrives as it always has, not through proclamation or announcement, but through the imperceptible accumulation of changes that transform darkness into light, sleep into waking, night into day. The rooster, having exhausted his enthusiasm for premature dawn calls, now maintains a dignified silence that might be interpreted either as acknowledgement of his error or simply as the natural quieting that comes to creatures whose internal clocks have finally resynchronized with external reality. His presence in the eaves of the baker's cottage remains unchanged, but his voice no longer disturbs the village peace with false claims about the hour. The warmth from the bread ovens continues to provide comfort in the cooling air, but the bird himself seems content to wait for genuine dawn, rather than manufacturing it through vocal insistence. In the monastery dormitory, Brother Francis experiences the slow return to consciousness that characterizes natural awakening after interrupted sleep. Put his body, drawn from the second sleeps embraced by the rooster's confusion, but never fully separated from rest's restorative power, now finds its way back toward the surface of awareness with the gradual inevitability of a bubble rising through still water. The narrow bed, the scratchy brown blanket, the thin straw mattressol, the physical realities that define his nighttime world resemble themselves around his returning consciousness like familiar friends, welcoming him back to the waking realm. The dormitory around him participates in the same gentle transition, the collective breathing of sleeping monks, gradually shifting from the profound rhythms of the second sleep toward the lighter patterns that herald approaching consciousness. Brother Thomas, in the adjacent bed, maintains his peaceful rest, but shows subtle signs of the body's preparation for waking slight changes in posture. Minor adjustments that speak to systems preparing for the day's demands, even while consciousness remains suspended in sleep's merciful embrace. Brother Matthew, whose responsibility for the community's prayer schedule had drawn him fully awake during the rooster's temporal confusion, now rests in the particular state of partial sleep that comes to those who maintain vigilance even while seeking restoration. His consciousness hovers near the surface of awareness, ready to respond to legitimate calls for prayer, while still allowing his body the rest it requires. This delicate balance between duty and restoration speaks to the careful compromises that make monastic life sustainable over years and decades of service. The monastery chapel, where the continuous candle has maintained its vigil throughout all the night's temporal uncertainties, begins to receive the first genuine hints of approaching dawn through the oiled parchment windows. The light comes not as sudden illumination, but as the gradual lessening of darkness's subtle shift from the complete blackness of deep night toward the gray ambiguity that precedes true sunrise. The candle's flame, which during the rooster's false dawn had seemed to burn with defensive brightness against temporal confusion, now dances with the quiet confidence of light that no longer stands alone against the darkness. In the village cottages, the natural progression toward morning manifests differently in each dwelling, shaped by the particular circumstances of individual families and their responses to the night's interrupted rhythms. Thomas the carpenter, lying in the loft shared with Margaret and little Anne, finds his consciousness returning through layers of awareness that speak to the complex relationship between sleep and waking. His body, wise with the experience of 43 years of physical labor, recognizes the approaching dawn through signals too subtle for conscious analysis. Changes in air pressure, shifts in temperature, the gradually increasing sounds of early morning activity that penetrate even the deepest rest. Margaret, beside him, experiences the mother's particular form of morning awareness, her consciousness rising toward the surface of wakefulness, while her body maintains the protective alertness that has monitored her. Families rest throughout the night. Little Anne, pressed between her parents, continues the profound sleep that comes naturally to children. But even her rest begins to show the subtle signs of approaching consciousness, slight changes in breathing patterns, minor movements that speak to dreams, beginning their transition toward the possibility of waking thought. The cottage around them seems to participate in this gradual awakening, the timber frame adjusting to the subtle temperature changes that accompany the transition from night to day. The sounds of expansion and contraction that mark daily cycles of heating and cooling begin their familiar rhythm. But now these sounds carry the promise of warmth and activity rather than the settling into rest that had characterized their evening counterparts. The drop of water that had marked earlier transitions in the night's progression continues its patient accumulation in the sagging beam overhead. But now its inevitable descent will find a household gradually stirring toward consciousness rather than deeply claimed by sleep. The sound, when it comes, will join the growing symphony of morning noises rather than punctuating the profound quiet of nighttime rest. In the stone house where Sir Edmund makes his residence, the approach of dawn brings its own particular character to the gradual awakening process. The stone walls, which during the night had radiated coolness despite the carefully banked fires, now begin to absorb the first hints of warming air that speak to the sun's approach below the horizon. Lady Eleanor, beneath her fine linen sheets and wool blankets, stirs from the light sleep that had followed the rooster's temporal confusion, with the automatic awareness that comes to those whose social position requires constant attention to time and propriety. The carved bed frame, which during the night's deepest hours had supported their rest in dignified silence, now creaks softly as both occupants begin the subtle movements that precede full awakening. Sir Edmund, whose sleep had remained deeper than his wife's despite the rooster's interruption, begins to show the signs of approaching consciousness that speak to a man whose administrative responsibilities require punctual attention to daily duties. Their son Richard, in his small adjacent chamber, experiences the 17-year-old's particular form of morning awareness. The gradual transition from sleep's embrace toward the complex thoughts and concerns that define his approaching adulthood. The privacy of his sleeping space, which during the night had provided perfect conditions for restoration, now becomes the environment within which he must transition from the simple needs of physical rest toward the complicated demands of social and political awareness. Throughout the village, similar processes of gentle awakening unfold in cottage after cottage, each family finding its own rhythm for the transition. From night's rest to morning's responsibilities. In the weaver's house, Eleanor rises toward consciousness with the automatic awareness of a woman whose daily tasks require early attention, while Walter maintains the deeper sleep that comes to men whose physical labor demands thorough restoration before facing another day of demanding work. Their sons, Geoffrey and young William, continue their profound, youthful slumber, but begin to show the subtle signs of approaching consciousness that speak to growing bodies, preparing for another day of development and learning. The shared bed that had seemed narrow during earlier phases of the night now provides exactly the right amount of space for two forms beginning to stir toward wakefulness. In the cottage where the miller's family sleeps to the sound of the wheel turning in the stream below, young Peter finds his consciousness returning through the familiar rhythm of mechanical sound that has provided the soundtrack to his entire life. The mill wheel's rotation, unchanged throughout all the night's temporal confusions, now seems to speak more clearly of the coming day's work grain to be ground into flour, customers to be served, the endless cycle of agricultural labor that defines their community's survival. Peter's father, the miller himself, maintains his deep sleep with the stubborn determination of a man whose work requires physical strength that can only be restored through complete rest. But even his profound slumber begins to show signs of the body's preparation for consciousness, subtle adjustments that speak to systems preparing for another day of demanding labor. Margaret, the miller's wife, with their baby daughter sleeping between herself and her husband, experiences the particular form of maternal awakening that allows consciousness to return gradually while maintaining protective awareness of her child's need. The baby continues her innocent sleep, untouched by the temporal confusions that had affected the adult world. But even infant rest begins to show the subtle signs of approaching consciousness that speak to biological rhythms older than human understanding. In the cottage where the widow Alice lives alone, the approach of dawn brings both comfort and challenge to her solitary awakening. The darkness that had seemed complete during the rooster's false announcements now begins to lighten with the gradual inevitability that speaks to morning's genuine arrival. Alice, whose sleep since her husband's death has remained lighter than the communal rest enjoyed by families, finds her consciousness returning through familiar pathways of solitary awareness. She rises from her bed, her joints protesting the movement with the accumulated complaints of 63 years, but responding more easily than they had during the premature stirring hours earlier. The cottage, which during the night had seemed perfectly warm despite the dying fire, now requires attention to prepare for the day's activities. Alice moves toward her small hearth, where the coals she had tended during the rooster's confusion have maintained sufficient warmth to kindle new flames. The wooden crucifix on the wall above her bed, invisible during the night's darkness, gradually becomes visible in the slowly increasing light that filters through the gaps in her shutters. The carved figure seems to offer its morning benediction over her stirring, a reminder that each day begins with the possibility of grace and the promise of divine companionship through whatever challenges the daylight hours may bring. Alice whispers her morning prayer, not the formal Latin of monastic tradition, but the simple English petition that connects her to generations of women who have faced the dawn with faith and determination. Lord, grant me strength for this new day, and help me find peace in whatever work awaits. The words, worn smooth by countless repetitions, provide comfort and structure for the transition from sleep's private world to the public demands of daily life. Throughout the village, the genuine dawn continues its gradual arrival, with the reliability that distinguishes natural processes from human attempts to control or hurry them. The light comes not through dramatic announcement, but through imperceptible accumulation. Each moment slightly brighter than the last, each breath carrying air slightly warmer than its predecessor. The roosters, having learned through their earlier era, now maintain dignified silence, until genuine dawn provides legitimate reason for their proclamations. The monastery bell remains silent as well, waiting for the proper hour to call the brothers to lauds and the formal beginning of another day's cycle of prayer and work. Brother Matthew, maintaining his vigil between sleep and consciousness, monitors the gradually increasing light with a practiced awareness of one whose responsibility requires precise attention to the proper timing of spiritual observances. The village buildings themselves seem to participate in this gradual awakening, their timber frames and stone walls responding to the subtle temperature changes that accompany true dawn. Sounds that had been muffled by the night's profound quiet now begin to carry more clearly the distant lowing of cattle in the common field, the soft rustle of early, rising birds in the thatch and eaves, the barely audible whisper of wind through the harvested fields that surround the community. Even the domestic animals recognize the approaching dawn through signals unavailable to human awareness. The cattle in the common field begin their slow stirring toward consciousness, their breathing creating small clouds of vapor in the cooling air that speak to the coming transition from rest to grazing. The chickens in their coops start the soft murmuring that precedes their daily emergence into the world of pecking and scratching, and the eternal search for edible morsels. The village cat, that battle-scarred Tom, who belongs to everyone and no one, concludes his nighttime hunting activities and seeks a comfortable spot for the brief rest that will prepare him for another day of territorial patrol and strategic begging. His sleep lighter than human slumber, but still restorative by feline standards. allows him to maintain alertness to opportunities, while still providing the restoration his body requires. In the monastery dormitory, Brother Francis finds his consciousness, returning to full awareness with the gratitude of a man who has learned not to take peaceful sleep for granted. The interruption caused by the rooster's temporal confusion has not prevented his body from finding the restoration it required, and he rises toward wakefulness with the sense of having been blessed by rest despite the night's irregularities. The narrow bed, the scratchy blanket, the thin straw mattressole, the apparent hardships of monastic sleeping arrangements now seem exactly suited to his simple needs. The dormitory around him breathes with the collective rhythm of men, beginning their transition from sleep's private realm to the communal activities that define monastic life. Each brother rises toward consciousness at his own pace, but all participate in the shared process of preparing for another day of prayer and work, study and service. The stone walls that surround them, worn smooth by centuries of weather and blessed by countless prayers, seem to exhale their own benediction over the stirring community. Brother Matthew, recognizing the signs of genuine dawn through the gradually increasing light that filters through the dormitory windows, begins his preparations for calling the community to Lord's. The bell that had offered gentle correction to the rooster's premature announcements now awaits its proper moment to proclaim the legitimate arrival of morning and summon the brothers to their first formal prayer of the new day. As the light continues its gradual increase, the village begins to show the subtle signs of approaching full consciousness. Smoke starts to rise from cottage chimneys as fires are rekindled or tended to greater brightness. The sounds of early morning activity, the soft rustle of movement within buildings, the distant splash of someone drawing water, the barely audible murmur of early conversation, begin to replace the profound quiet that had characterized the night's rest. The mill wheel continues its steady rotation in the stream below the miller's cottage, its rhythm unchanged by the night's temporal confusions or the approaching dawn. But now the sound begins to carry different associations, not the lullaby that had deepened sleep, but the promise of productive work ahead. The mechanical rhythm speaks to the continuities that transcend individual rest and waking, connecting the village to larger patterns of labor and survival that have governed human communities since agriculture first replaced hunting as the primary means of sustenance. Thomas the carpenter, fully conscious now, but not yet ready to leave the shared warmth of his family's bed, listens to the gradual increase in morning sounds with the practiced awareness of a man whose work requires attention to the subtle signals that govern daily activities. The timber frame of his cottage, responding to the gradually warming air, begins its daily cycle of expansion that will continue until evening brings the cooling that allows contraction and rest. Margaret, beside him, also reaches full consciousness while maintaining the comfortable position that shared sleep has made familiar. Her body, which throughout the night had monitored their daughter's breathing and movements with automatic maternal vigilance, now prepares for the conscious attention that daytime childcare requires. Little Anne, still sleeping between her parents, begins to show the subtle signs of approaching wakefulness that speak to the child's natural rhythm, preparing for another day of growth and learning. The cottage around them completes its transition from nighttime stillness to morning readiness. The familiar sounds of wooden spoons stirring porridge pots, of fire pokers nudging embers back to flame, of hushed voices negotiating chores before the full noise of day takes hold. The wind shifts slightly, carrying with it the smell of damp earth, coal smoke, and freshly turned straw. Above the village, the clouds thin, revealing streaks of pink and gold that announce the sun's patient ascent over the horizon. Thomas stretches carefully, mindful of joints grown stiff in the chill, and glances down at an now blinks up at him with the blurry confusion of a child still between sleep and wakefulness. Margaret leans over and places a kiss on the child's forehead. We put a wordless ritual, repeated countless times before, repeated countless times to come. In the weaver's cottage, Eleanor ties her apron over her shift as she stokes the fire, while Walter groans softly and rubs sleep from his eyes. Geoffrey grumbles, William scratches, and life resumes. Brother Francis, robe now wrapped around him, steps into the monastery corridor, lit with pale morning light. The bell has not yet rung, but it will. His feet, bare on cold stone, feel firmer now than the night before. He bows briefly to the chapel door, in passing not from obligation, but from quiet gratitude. He has slept, and more than that, he has rested. Alice, the widow, pulls open her shutters to the fields beyond. A mist still lingers, softening the shapes of distant trees and barns. She lets the air into her lungs, closes her eyes, and whispers, Amen. And so, in Millhaven, the morning returns not as an event, but as a renewaler, breath drawn in after the long exhale of night. The discomforts remain. The straw still pokes, the wool still scratches, the roof still leaks, but the sleep, fragmented though it was, gave the village what it needed: a pause, a surrender, a bomb. No one speaks of the rooster's mistake. They will eat, they will work, they will age, they will sleep again. The rhythm will continue, as it always has, with bodies laid down like seeds in the furrows of the night. The village wakes, the village endures, the village sleeps.